Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Oasis Focus and Finance Show. I'm your host, Shafiq Morton. As always, it's great to be with you. On August the 3rd, the country went to the polls in the 2016 municipal elections. As we all know, the results are out and there have been some significant shifts on our political landscape. In today's show, we're going to have a look at the short and long-term possible impacts on us. And in studio with me are Daniel King and Isma-el Ebrahim. Gentlemen, assalamu alaikum and welcome to the show.
Hello. Alaikum salam.
Daniel, we're going to start off with you. What were the major shifts? What were the important shifts in this election which has seen significant changes?
Well, I think if you look at it on a consolidated national basis, the most analysed and widely reported shift was the decline in the proportion of the vote that went to the ANC, and it looked like it was largely in favour of the Democratic Alliance and the EFF. Although by far the biggest driver of that shift was the decline in absolute number of voters moving to the ANC, rather than an increase in the Democratic Alliance and the EFF support base in absolute terms, especially since 2014. Most of the media analysis around the issue has also focused largely on the the metropolitan municipalities, where no single party would get an outright majority. So, for example, in Gauteng, where the ANC lost its outright majority in all of the metros there, and also in a place like Nelson Mandela Bay Metro in the Eastern Cape. But if you look more closely at the statistics, I think one interesting thing to point out is that the loss was more broad than that, in fact, and it extended to non-metro areas as well, which paints, I think, a little bit of a more worrying picture for the ruling party heading towards 2019. Another less reported shift was in favour of the IFP, a relatively small party, but that especially in KZN, where the NFP, which was presented as an alternative to that party, failed to register for this election. So they benefited by default from that. And then also, if we look at parties that are declining in their share of support, COPE stands out amongst those. They seem to have lost the majority of their proportional vote that they earned in 2011. So between 2011 and now, most of that vote is gone. And then also quite a notable increase in the share of the vote going to very small parties and your independent candidates since 2011. So I think at the end of the day, what can be said for certain is that this was probably the most competitive election that we've had in the democratic era in South Africa. And interestingly, it might bode well for the average citizen in those areas, especially where there's no more single party dominance, because increasingly I think the view is now that a failure to connect with your voter base will in fact be punished at the polls.
Isma-el, these were definitely the most interesting elections to cover, but what are the essential differences and changes with this election compared to the past municipal ones?
Shafiq, the last elections that we had was more focused on national elections or elections of the National Assembly. So in that situation, any South African citizen over 18 years can register to vote and can vote, and that doesn't matter whether you are resident in the country or not. So even if you're resident outside the country, you can still cast your vote. In elections of the provincial legislature or municipal elections, it really is restricted to the province in which you reside and the ward in which you reside. So generally, because it's not a national election, we generally see a lower voter turnout, or because there is less interest. In terms of the results or the key changes that we've seen, I think it was interesting in that for the first time we're seeing a big shift for the ANC. So in fact, for the first time, as Daniel alluded to earlier, they've dropped below 60%, and that is despite the number of voters compared to the last municipal election being around 57 to 58% voter turnout. So that's interesting, and it also leaves many of the municipalities hung. And what that means is coalitions will become more important. It's also the first time we see the EFF contest in a municipal election. So the last election that they contested in was the national election. And so while it's the first time we see their performance on the local side, it also gives us an opportunity to gauge the momentum, their growth momentum from the last national election. So that's also a very good indication of the shift in the political environment. And then I think what's also important is the results of the elections. The key difference is it highlights the importance of political analysis because of the shifts. Like Daniel alluded to earlier, coalitions become important, and that makes, from an investment point of view, it makes political analysis more important so you can understand policy making and the impacts going forward.
Daniel, what happens in the hung municipalities where no party enjoys an absolute majority? Nelson Mandela, Bay, Tshwane and Johannesburg, I think, are the sort of the key places in point.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's a number of different scenarios that could play out. The first option, generally speaking, is for two or more parties to enter into a coalition, which is essentially just a power sharing agreement. And that's similar to what we saw, for example, as the DA transitioned into power in Cape Town, for example. And that really is also what the media analysis in the weeks following the election have been emphasizing, particularly with respect to the EFF. You know, the emphasis has been on who the EFF may enter into a coalition with, especially in the Gauteng metros, which are really important. But of course, the nature of politics is that this can change all within a single day. So really all of the analysis on that coalition building should be taken with a big pinch of salt. If a formal coalition could not be formed, there is the second option where the largest party in the municipality could try and form a minority government. But that's obviously far less stable and workable than a coalition government, and could result ultimately in the failure of the municipal government to deliver on its mandate to the people because of that conflict. And if that fails, for example, or if, for example, the council is unable to elect a mayor or a speaker at its first sitting, it could then force a rerun of the polls itself. So, as I said, I mean, it's worth remembering that any coalition analysis should be taken with a pinch of salt until the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, because anything can happen in the lead up to that initial council sitting.
Isma-el, I think this is quite a crucial question. What are municipal governments responsible for as opposed to provincial and national?
Yeah, so you correctly indicate there are three spheres of government in South Africa. You've got national, provincial, and then also municipal, or what we refer to sometimes as local. They actually play a very important role because they actually are predominantly responsible for service delivery, and that has generally a direct impact on your life. So whether it's water, electricity, refuse removal, sanitation, the likes of firefighting services, healthcare services, local roads, that type of thing, they are all responsible for that. So it's important not to underestimate the impact that the sphere of, let's call it municipal government, can play. An interesting stat in a survey conducted by the World Bank indicated that, in fact, in South Africa, for South African entrepreneurs, it does have a bearing where you locate your business because of the difference in service delivery amongst different municipalities. So if we can, as South Africans, if we can improve the benchmarking and sort of set a standard across all our municipalities that equalizes the playing field, so that no matter where you are, whether you are in Mpumalanga or Limpopo, you know, the service delivery and the services that you are offered, whether it's construction, permitting, electricity, water, are all benchmarked to a specific standard, a high level. We can actually improve the ease of doing business, and it can improve South Africa's ranking as well as how the rest of the world perceive us. You might even see businesses coming to South Africa just because it's much easier to do business there. So from an investment perspective, I think that's also very important. Local governments do have an important role to play and must not be underestimated.
And Daniel, very quickly, I mean, how does this affect provincial and national policy making at a municipal level if you've got a different municipality to your provincial and your national ones?
Yeah, theoretically speaking, it should be relatively minimal because according to the law, the three spheres of government, the national, provincial, municipal, are autonomous, operationally autonomous. So they shouldn't really be seen as hierarchical, and it shouldn't alter fundamentally the way in which national and provincial governments do operate. But of course, that does require a lot of political maturity from all parties, because effectively we now have a situation where different political parties increasingly are controlling different spheres of government. And there are ways in which, according to the law, the national and provincial government can intervene and possibly undermine municipal government management, which of course needs to be watched closely by civil society and the media as well, for example. But we must also remember that our judicial system, our constitution is very clear on the separation of powers between the different arms of government and between the different spheres of government, between national and municipal governments. But I think, of course, come 2019, that is when we are likely to see a much more direct impact on the national and provincial governments, because that is when we're going to be embarking on those national and provincial elections again.
Daniel, let's start off with you again. What next for the ruling party? They've taken some bitter body blows this election.
Yeah, there will, of course, be, I think, quite a long period of deep introspection from the ruling party that is necessary for them. And, they themselves have even said that is the case for them, because these elections have certainly been the clearest message to them that something has deteriorated in the public perception since 2014. So that's only over a period of 2 years they've lost a proportional representation of about 8% nationally. So it is plausible that we might not actually get much information about which way the ruling party is going to turn over the next year or so until its internal conference in 2017. But certainly by that point, I expect that they will have elected a new president, if not by then at the elective conference, and will have a much clearer picture of which way they're likely to turn from an ideological perspective, from a policy-making perspective, and then just how the new political landscape is likely to be shaped. And that's going to be vitally important for them and their performance in the national and provincial government elections in 2019. So that's really where there's going to be a huge amount at stake, I think, because it's going to be a massive test for our democratic maturity, because really more than 85% of consolidated government expenditure, so that's your government, your real economic power of the government, is at the national and the provincial level. So to the extent that their national and provincial network of patronage has been made stable by that spending power, we might see quite a lot more tension leading up to, over the next 3 years leading up to 2019, both within the ruling party and then also in terms of inter-party politics heading to that very significant event.
Isma-el, one interesting thing about the elections at the IEC Centre, as journalists, there was quite a buzz because I think on the first or the second day the news came through that the rand had strengthened quite considerably. The strengthening of the rand, is it attributable to the municipal elections or is it due to other factors?
I think the local events did play a role to some extent. However, we can't also ignore the impact that the global, where we are from a global perspective also had. So from the local perspective, we actually saw the rand strengthening slightly before the actual elections and before the results started to come out or the polls started to come out. And what that indicates is clearly we've had a free and fair election. There's been a lack of violence, which some people may have been expecting, and that is testament to the democracy that we have. And that's renewed confidence, not only from South Africans, but also globally. It's renewed confidence in the fact that, while the ANC or the outright majority of the ANC has dropped, it increases the need for coalitions, it increases political competition, and it increases accountability, the ability to keep the leading party accountable for their decision making. So I think that is the positive on the local side, and it allows them not to rest on their laurels and become complacent. But from a global perspective, we must also remember that we have seen, interest rates actually remain low. In the UK, in fact, we've seen them dropping slightly. They've decreased the policy rates. And in the US, the rhetoric there is that, we could see a continued slower pace or a slower approach to increasing interest rates eventually. So that continues to make emerging market yields more competitive, because interest rates in South Africa are quite high. If you compare it to globally, 1-2%, South Africa is quite competitive. So generally we've seen about a 1% increase in overall emerging markets. So that's generally other emerging market countries like ourselves as well. Now the political environment has played an impact, or our political events have played an impact, and we actually saw the rand increasing about 3.8%. Obviously the currency is very difficult to call. And what we saw in 2008, 2009, there is a possibility that it could increase to the same way that we saw it increase back then. But back then it was supported by very strong commodity prices, which we don't see. We're not in that same environment on the commodity front. But generally, we do expect the US to continue a hiking cycle or get towards a hiking cycle, and that is negative for the rand because our yields become less competitive. So generally, we are actually very cautious on the rand. And like I said, it is very difficult, but we remain cautious in terms of the outlook.
Isma-el, the follow-up to this, how do you manage political risk when you invest domestically?
I think it's something very important to pay attention to. In our investment due diligence process, it's certainly something that we place a significant emphasis on, and that is really understanding the political risk, understanding the political environment, the ebbs and flows within South Africa. From a monitoring perspective, we continue to monitor the performance of government, and that may be, how well or are they managing to implement the National Development Plan. We look at things like gauging the social temperature. We can measure, how many events of social unrest have there been over the last 12 months. Things like that we continue to monitor because it gives us a good feel for the political environment. Importantly, major shifts in political environment could indicate a shift in policy. Now, shifts in policy do have investment implications over the medium term, not just the short term. So it is something that we continue to monitor. But importantly, like we've said in the past, we continue to highlight that is why diversification is so important. And products like we have on the market, our balanced funds, they do give you that diversification. We generally look at 5 elements of diversification, whether it's sectoral diversification, currency diversification, geographical, asset class, and instrument diversification. So we continue to place emphasize to our clients that diversification is important because either which way shifts go, you do sort of impact any major negative shift.
And Daniel, finally, are we seeing the dawning of a new era in South African politics? A very grand question and statement.
Yeah, I think if we just look at the trajectory of single party dominance since 1994, compared to where we are today, this I think may very well be the start of a new and more competitive era at least. But really there, of course, are a number of different ways it could go. And any number of these could be associated with a high road or a low road kind of outcome over the medium to long term. Now, in the high road scenarios, we would see greater accountability, better service delivery, and more respect for South African voters and the rule of law in general. And as Isma-el stated previously, in that kind of scenario where your municipalities are better governed and they all kind of align with the best practices in the country, South Africa could be a vastly more competitive place than what it is today. We could enter into the top 25 most competitive economies in the world just by getting everyone to the same standard. But in a low road type of scenario, we could also see more political brinksmanship, political games, more violence and instability in general in our national politics. And of course, our hope is that we as a country do take the high road as an economy, which will ultimately be to the benefit of everyone through greater private sector investment, greater employment. And we don't believe that is out of reach, as we've said this, and as the World Bank has stated in its previous studies, there's a relatively low bar that is set to get to that level of competitiveness globally. And in fact, we believe that it's probably more likely now than it was a year ago.
Daniel King and Isma-el Ebrahim, shukran. Thanks for talking to us about the 2016 municipal elections.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And of course, a special thanks to our guests in today's show, Daniel King and Isma-el Ebrahim, discussing the 2016 municipal elections. Of course, it is early days, and we still have to wait to see who is going to be in bed with who in terms of the coalitions in places such as Tshwane, Nelson Mandela Bay, and of course, Johannesburg. On this show, we'll keep you updated with all the developments, particularly in light of short-term and long-term investments, and of course, prospects for the whole overall political landscape of our country, which impacts us all. Should you wish to watch this or any of our other shows, you can log into the Oasis Crescent YouTube channel. If you would like to contact us, you can dial 0860 100 786 or log into www.oasiscrescent.com. Until next time, I'm your host, Shafiq Morton. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.